Martin Taylor. Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, hello. Everyone say hello, Martin. He did say hello. It is a people's court. We can talk.
I'll have the next slide, please. Martin Taylor. I'm the conservation scientist with WWF Australia, which is known in some parts of the world as the World Wildlife Fund, and Australia as the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. I want to come from a global perspective down to Australia. WWF has done a report called the Living Forest Report, and we've come up with 11 deforestation fronts throughout the world where up to 170 million hectares could be cleared up to 2030, right? Now, one of those fronts, the only developing country in that list of deforestation fronts is Australia, right? Now, with deference to WA is not in there, I'm sorry, but what we had to focus down on where weaknesses in the law were resulting in the largest scale of deforestation, and that was in Eastern Australia. Have the next slide, please. And so if we looked at the Eastern Australia deforestation fronts, between 3 and 6 million hectares of forest loss is projected to occur. And when I say forest, I'm using the Kyoto definition of forest, and I'm not talking just the tall eucalypt forests. We're also talking brigalow, a lot of the western woodlands, like in WA as well. So we're talking open woodland, 20% crown cover and upwards, right? So next slide, please. So we're just emphasising Eastern Australia, and we go on to the next slide. And so what are the causes, the drivers? Well, as we've, without a doubt, in most of those fronts, livestock lead the pack, agriculture second, and forestry tends to be second tier down in Australia as well. And then small scale agriculture, and particularly when they say colonisation, that includes, you know, Springfield as well, right? So that's colonisation, right? Where you're moving into primary forest, knocking it down to build housing. That's happening a lot in southeast Queensland. So if we go to the next slide. So let's drill down. Pasture is the big driver, so just clearing for livestock pasture, right? And it's a forestry second tier. The reasons we focused on Eastern Australia is because of the weaker law in Queensland and the proposed weakening of the law in New South Wales. So if we go to the next slide. So weak enforcement and self-assessable codes came into land clearing laws in 2012 in Queensland, and then the law itself was actually gutted in 2013. And primary forest clearing tripled since 2011-12, so these are intact forests cleared mostly again for forestry and livestock. And you see that's the maroon section. Now, one of the biggest things that is like a hidden source of destruction of forests that we haven't talked about is what's called thinning. They call it thinning. It's the most atrocious legal pretense you can think of, is that these forests, after they're thinned, where up to 80 to 90% of the trees can be bulldozed, are still mapped as remnant intact forests. Right? They're still mapped as legal, so the legal pretense is that this is still intact forest because we're doing the forest a favour by taking out all those excess trees in there, see? So this is just one property in around Augathella, and you can see all the laneways cut with bulldozers. Those are about 10 to 15 metres wide on the right-hand image, and the left-hand image is before the thinning took place. And this can be done without any permit, just by reference to self-assessable codes now, and it's going on a massive scale at the moment in Queensland, right? This is happening on a massive scale. And this, of course, is leased land, where native title still is at least legally supposed to exist. No consultation, whatever, with traditional owners, not even required. Shocking stuff, in my view. Next slide, please. So what are the impacts? Wildlife deaths so before the Vegetation Management Act actually came in 2000, in 1999, 100 million native mammals, birds and reptiles were dying yearly as a result of broad-scale clearing. It included over 2 million mammals, right? And these are estimates. Now, we're back up to at least half of those levels of clearing again. So we can say in the tens of millions of animals are being killed right now by bulldozers in Queensland. Next slide, please. In New South Wales, we estimated that because of the Act, so we flipped it, because of the introduction of land clearing controls in 2005, we were estimating that there was avoided deaths of about 116,000 mammals a year. That's just mammals, right? So just mammals who are avoiding being killed is on that scale. Next slide, please. This is it's what I call a hidden animal welfare crisis. We always think of animal welfare as just to do with pets, and surely those are serious animal welfare concerns, livestock themselves. But of course, what about all the hundreds of millions of animal deaths, injured animals because of land clearing? Here's Mark Townend, the RSPCA, saying our wildlife impact continues to rise with ongoing habitat destruction. Wildlife emissions more than doubled from 11-12 to 14-15. Next slide, please. Koalas, we heard about koalas, huge impacts. This is AKF, Australian Koala Foundation mapping. 84,000 hectares koala habitat cleared in just 2 years since the law was gutted in 2013. And because New South Wales is intent on following Queensland's direction on this, we have just estimated that over 2 million hectares of koala habitat in New South Wales is at risk because of the pending repeal of the land clearing laws in New South Wales. It's not just the death from the bulldozers themselves that kills these animals, it's the survivors that are forced to search for new habitat, and that of course leads them into increased death just from stress, contact with cars and dogs. Next slide, please. But the net effect of all this death and destruction, over 1,300 species in Australia are threatened. That's the EPBC list, by tree clearing, habitat loss and degradation. Next slide, please. We have the impact of carbon emissions. Land clearing in Queensland before the law came in used to account for 15% of national emissions, right? 15% of national emissions were just land clearing just in Queensland, right? Well, guess what? We're back to 6%. So we're almost halfway back to where we were in 1990 with carbon emissions. And you can see that the rising curve again of carbon emissions. Next slide, please. Of course, the other impact is water pollution. Tree clearing aggravates erosion and water pollution due to the clearing itself, so by disturbing the soil, opening the soil up, but also the land use which follows, right? Which is going to be either crops or cows, mostly cows, and so that land use itself generates yet more pollution. And the net effect, next slide, of course, is what puts the Great Barrier Reef in danger, one of our most important biodiversity assets, to use the language of business. So this is what the Auditor General had to say last year about the impact of land clearing in reef catchments. So I'll just leave it there and leave it for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. One question that we're sort of putting to everybody is, what do you think needs to happen?
Well, a couple of things. The EPBC Act reform is important, but one thing I'd like to point out is that the EPBC Act, as we have it, and the triggers that we have are not being applied. I've just estimated there's about 200,000 hectares that was cleared in just the last 2 years since the Queensland legislation was gutted. More than 200,000 hectares of mapped habitat for EPBC listed species and ecological community was bulldozed in Queensland with not a single referral under the EPBC Act. How can that happen? Why? Because it's for farming, it's for agriculture, it's for cows. And so nobody's even, not even bothering to refer anymore, and Canberra's simply ignoring it. So there's a huge enforcement gap where clearing is simply going on, it's not being referred, and Canberra the government is not doing anything. So we actually have triggers there that aren't being used. It's like a de facto exemption, just like the RFA exemption. It's a de facto exemption because they're simply not enforcing the law.
Thank you. Panel members?
Ask
Yes,
on that point,
please.
are they mandatory referral requirements that are being ignored, or what is
Yes. I mean, as you know, under the Act, you are required to refer an action that may significantly impact a matter of national environmental significance, and they're simply just not doing it. And so we had the recent phenomenon, and hats off to them for finally doing it, but the federal government actually called in the Kingvale clearing up in Cape York, where a high-value agriculture permit had been issued, and they called it in and halted the clearing. But you multiply that by 20, 30 times, and you've got a much bigger problem that's just being unaddressed.
And sorry, just following on quickly, but from that point then, do you think it would be worthwhile for someone to bring a case in the federal court for declaratory relief, impugning what has been occurring in that regard?
Well, I think yes. There's plenty of opportunity to prosecute land clearing that they haven't even referred it. It's actually mapped threatened species habitat. It's shocking, the level of negligence.
Thank you, Brendan.
Yeah, so of course one of the things that's changed since the EPBC Act was brought in, and also when the RFAs were negotiated and brought in, is of course the impacts of human-forced climate change are now extant and visible in all sectors, including in our forest ecosystems. So you mentioned the emissions from the carbon emissions from land clearing. In terms of what we need to do, leaving aside the EPBC Act, are there any other kind of policy or statutory opportunities that the climate change mitigation might provide here to help?
Well, I think in the previous election, the Labor Party had advocated the adoption of a carbon trigger, an emissions trigger under the EPBC Act, and certainly that would have been a good thing to have. And they focused directly on the emissions from land clearing, which were being not considered. But of course, my response to that was, mate, you've already got plenty of triggers, you're just not using them. But I guess the other important thing is the heads of agreement on the environment in Australia. We've got a heads of agreement in which the Commonwealth only has an interest in the clearing of native vegetation. I would like to see that changed to that agreement negotiated, considering the failures of state governments to properly regulate land clearing, and that should become Commonwealth responsibility in the heads of agreement on the environment. That's a bit abstract, sorry, but that's certainly, if you want to really go back, let's renegotiate the whole terms of Commonwealth state responsibility on land clearing.
Excellent. I think we're out of time for this discussion, and we'll move on. Can we all please say thank you very much to Martin?